In the ballroom of the Belmont mansion, between raised champagne flutes and practiced fake smiles, Madeline could barely keep herself standing. She wore a borrowed silk gown, her makeup smudged by tears she'd tried and failed to hide. In front of her, the divorce papers shook in her hands like they were screaming everything no one dared to say out loud. And all around, 200 people watching the scene as if it were just another part of the Christmas decor. Her husband, Preston, didn't move an inch. Her mother-in-law smiled like someone who'd just won a dirty game. And Madeline, well, she signed. With champagne and shame still wet on her fingers, she signed because she thought she had nothing left. No name, no voice, no future. What she didn't know yet was that on that very same night, the world was already getting ready to call her by another name. Now tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? City, state, country? I'd love to know how far this story is traveling. The Belmont Mansion's ballroom looked like it had been ripped from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers reflecting off gold-toned walls, violinists playing soft Christmas songs, and a parade of designer suits and couture gowns gliding across polished marble. At the center of that spectacle stood Madeline, holding onto a controlled smile, while her heart stumbled in her chest. Married to Preston Belmont, heir to one of the most powerful families in Chicago, she tried to hide how small she felt in all that cold elegance. But that night, built entirely on appearances, was about to shatter piece by piece. Out of nowhere, Preston stepped onto the small stage set up for the Christmas choir and asked for everyone's attention. Madeline turned toward him, confused, a mix of pride and dread rising in her throat. Then his voice, calm, sharp, almost bored, announced publicly that he was ending their marriage, right there, in front of 200 guests. The silence broke only when a splash of champagne hit Madeline's face. Margot Belmont, her mother-in-law, had thrown it without blinking. "When something's rotten, you throw it out," she said, loud enough for several people to hear. Laughter edged the corners of the room, half choked by etiquette, but still cruel. Madeline froze. With her face dripping and her dignity sliding down along the golden bubbles, she was led to a table as if she was signing a business deal, not the end of her own marriage. The papers waited there, next to the pen. Her trembling hands struggled to hold Preston, arms crossed, watched everything like it was just another corporate maneuver. Margot smiled, satisfied, and his sister, Clarissa, filmed the entire scene from the side with her phone, trying to be discreet and failing. When Madeline finally signed, it wasn't just paper tearing inside her. It was the last fragile hope that anyone in that room had ever truly loved her. She left the party without saying a single word, feeling the stares of pity and judgment slice down her back like knives. Outside, slow snowflakes had started to fall, as if the world out there were moving at a completely different pace, utterly unaware of the pain she carried. Her heels sank into ice, the dress clung cold against her skin, and the only thing she could hear was the muffled Christmas music fading behind her. That night, Madeline lost a lot. But without knowing it, she was about to discover something that would rewrite the entire trajectory of her life. And that something would come from a phone call none of those guests could have imagined. Madeline walked alone through the streets of Chicago like someone who'd just been kicked out of her own name. Snow piled on her shoulders, turning the once elegant gown into nothing more than a soaked, shapeless cloth. Storefronts glowed warm behind glass. Families gathered at tables for Christmas dinner looked like they belonged to another planet. She stopped on instinct in front of a small 24-hour diner. She needed to breathe, wash her face, and figure out what to do next. No phone. No money, no home. Just the echo of her humiliation pounding in her chest, like the party still hadn't ended. Inside, she went straight to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her swollen eyes. When she opened her purse, the only thing she'd grabbed before running out, she found a crumpled piece of paper. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the Belmont's front desk receptionist. "Man called for you before midnight, said it was urgent. Philip Lancaster, attorney, something about the name Wellington." Asked you to call back as soon as possible. None of it made sense. She'd never even heard that last name. But there was a phone number. Without overthinking, Madeline asked the girl at the counter if she could borrow the phone and dialed. The voice on the other end was firm but surprisingly gentle. "Miss Belmont," he asked, then paused. "Or should I say Miss Wellington?" Madeline went silent. Philip explained that he'd been trying to find her for weeks. Following genetic tests and old records, you were registered as stillborn. But in reality, you were taken from the hospital and raised under another name. Her father, Jonathan Wellington, billionaire founder of Wellington Global Industries, had never stopped looking for her. And now, with his health in critical condition, he wanted to see her that same night. Madeline leaned back against the diner wall, like the entire world had just slid out from under her feet. Jonathan Wellington, a name she knew from headlines, magazine covers, charity galas, and now, father. Philip continued, "He's at St. Mary's Hospital. I'm here with him, but we have to go now. Doesn't have much time." The diner seemed to spin around her. On the same day, she'd been reduced to nothing in front of 200 people. One simple sentence was about to rebuild her from the inside out. You belong to something far bigger than you ever imagined. And before the clock struck midnight, Madeline would walk into a hospital room, holding the answer to a question she hadn't even known she'd been asking her whole life. The silence in the hallway at St. Mary's Hospital was broken only by the steady beeping of heart monitors and the sharp click of Philip's dress shoes on polished tile. Madeline walked behind him with slow, dragging steps, like someone who was about to meet a stranger who'd somehow always lived inside her. The cold from outside still clung to her skin, but what shook most now was on the inside. They stopped at a door marked 412. The attorney looked at her with genuine respect. "He's weak, but he's lucid, and he's waited a long time for you." When she stepped inside, Madeline saw a pale man with an oxygen tube at his nose, but with eyes that were still strong, tracking every move she made. His features were sharp, his presence still imposing despite the failing body. Jonathan Wellington raised one hand, just a little. "You look just like your mother," he murmured with effort. Madeline moved closer in silence. There was no way to pretend any of this was normal. There is no script for meeting a father you've never known, especially a father who ran an empire while the world shuffled you from orphanage to foster home. Jonathan apologized, not for letting her be taken, no control over that, but for not finding her sooner. He told her everything. The birth, the kidnapping, the years of searching, the private investigators, the DNA results that finally completed the puzzle. "And now that I've found you, I need to prepare you." Madeline listened, caught between shock and a deep, aching sadness, as he explained that her new life wouldn't come only with wealth, but with danger. The biggest threat, his brother Raymond Wellington, the company's vice president, who had been embezzling funds for years, corrupting contracts, and driving away anyone who got too close to the truth. "I tried to protect you from the world, and the world from you," Jonathan said with a tired, crooked smile. "But now this company needs someone with courage." She just stayed there, holding his hand, trying to memorize every second they had left. The weight of what she was hearing wasn't just about inheritance or power. It was the weight of a stolen life being handed back to her, with interest in pain and unfinished promises. And in that room, with machines quietly beeping and her father's eyelids growing heavier, she made a decision. She would take on the legacy and face everything, Belmont's included. The days that followed were quiet on the outside and explosive on the inside. Madeline stayed in a temporary apartment Philip had arranged while she processed the truth about her past and the abyss ahead. Jonathan remained in the hospital, too weak for long meetings, but lucid enough to guide his daughter's first steps. Along with a small, trusted team, he put together a transition committee. Accountants, lawyers, strategic advisors, all with one mission: prepare Madeline to take over. Fast, she started training 12 hours a day, Negotiation sessions, contract reading, body language, balance sheets, international etiquette. There was a physical transformation too. Shorter hair, tailored suits, a new posture that matched the weight she was about to carry. But the biggest shift happened inside, and no one could teach that. It came from the open wound left by the Belmont's contempt. The taste of humiliation still pulsed in her mouth. That was what gave her new version a different name: Millionaire Grant. Millionaire was a carefully crafted identity, built to investigate, infiltrate, and above all, bring people down. Not with drama, but with evidence. With the help of one of Jonathan's oldest advisors, Millionaire began attending high-end events as a European investor interested in emerging American ventures. It took only 2 appearances before she caught the eye of Raymond Wellington and, to her surprise, the Belmonts themselves. The same people who'd thrown her out like trash now treated her as if she were a walking fortune. Preston saw her and didn't recognize her. That hurt more than she expected. But she didn't flinch. The goal was clear: corner all of them with proof, not screaming. With access to inner circles, Millionaire started collecting documents, recordings, email chains, and careless confessions at dinners soaked in expensive wine and badly kept secrets. She discovered that Raymond and Gregory Belmont, Preston's father, were partners in the same money laundering scheme. Clarissa Belmont used her event planning company to move part of the funds, and Margot was the bridge between the two worlds. She had helped Raymond keep Jonathan isolated during the worst moments at the company. Revenge was no longer just personal, it was structural. And the more Madeline uncovered, the more she understood. They hadn't just discarded her. They had almost destroyed the man who loved her before he ever had the chance to meet her. The next move would be made in front of the entire world. The Wellington Global Auditorium was packed that night under the polished pretext of a corporate philanthropy gala. Cameras, journalists, investors, shareholders, and financial heavyweights mingled, while servers glided by with crystal trays and digital screens flashed growth charts and glossy forecasts. It was the kind of event Raymond Wellington had planned to celebrate himself, confident Jonathan would never return and no one would ever see the cracks in the empire. There was just one detail he hadn't counted on: the presence of Millionaire Grant, now seconds away from dropping the mask. She stepped onto the stage without fanfare, introduced as an international investor. Her first lines were polite, almost bland, but slowly the spotlight shifted. "Before I put millions into any company, I like to see what's behind the facade. And in the case of Wellington Global, I found something the public deserves to know." A buzz ran through the room. Millionaire picked up a small remote and started the presentation. Altered spreadsheets, illegal transfers, fraudulent contracts, all bearing the signatures of Raymond and Gregory Belmont. What followed was a precise sequence of surgical strikes. She played recordings of secret meetings, showed cross-checked bank records, and finally a video of Raymond offering a bribe to silence an internal auditor. While the crowd struggled to process the shock, Millionaire took the final step. She removed her microphone, walked down from the stage, and in the middle of the room, took off her glasses and pushed her fringe aside. "My real name is Madeline Grace Wellington, and this is my house. My blood, my legacy." The room exploded. Security, already coordinated with federal agents, detained Raymond and Gregory on the spot under pre-issued warrants. Margot Belmont fainted near the side of the stage. When she saw her name tied to the accounts, Clarissa frantically tried to delete videos from her phone, but it was too late. The scandal was already spreading across social media like wildfire. And Preston, he simply collapsed into one of the front row chairs, staring at Madeline like he was seeing a ghost, and maybe he was. A ghost from his past who hadn't come back to beg, but to make things right. Madeline didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, she just watched. Their downfall wasn't a victory, it was closure. And there was still one last thing she needed to do, far from cameras, far from flashes, but very close to her heart. The days following the scandal were strangely quiet for Madeline. While the Wellington name dominated headlines and the Belmont family's fall became national news, she divided her time between company headquarters and the hospital. Jonathan Wellington was still alive, weak, exhausted, but lucid. He no longer followed meetings, interviews, or breaking news. Everything he cared about was seeing his daughter stand on her own. Every visit ended the same way. A long, lingering hand squeeze, like he was trying to memorize her presence before it turned into absence. Jonathan passed away 3 days after the public exposure, in the middle of the night. Pain, no drama. The medical team called just before sunrise, and Madeline somehow already knew before she answered. The funeral was small, closed to a handful of old allies, people who had known the man before the empire. There were no long speeches, no enormous wreaths, just one simple line carved into his headstone: Jonathan Wellington, father before he was a billionaire. There. Madeline didn't sob like she had on the Belmont's ballroom floor. She cried in silence, with the kind of grief that doesn't ask for an audience. Her official appointment came soon after. The board met, documents were signed, and Madeline took the presidency of Wellington Global Industries without a party, without champagne, without applause. The contrast with the night she'd signed her divorce couldn't have been sharper. That time, she'd signed as someone disposable. Now she signed as the woman holding up an entire empire. But the power didn't rush to her head. It settled heavy on her chest. She knew exactly what it felt like to stand on the outside of everything. That memory guided her first major decision. Madeline restructured entire divisions, removed executives tied to old schemes, and created an independent ethics council. Something her father had always wanted, but never managed to implement, surrounded by traitors. Then she publicly announced the Wellington Humanity Fund, focused on 3 clear pillars: education for youth without family, affordable housing, and psychological support for children raised in institutions. Not as marketing as reparations, as an answer. Meanwhile, the Belmonts faced the other side of the story. Gregory awaited trial. Margot sold whatever she could to pay legal fees. Clarissa vanished from social media. Preston tried to reach out once. A short email, no real apology, full of empty phrases. Madeline read it, closed it, and never replied. Not out of hatred, but because there was simply no room for him in the life she was now building. Months later, far from any camera, Madeline visited the cemetery where both of her parents rested. The mother she'd never known, and the man who had spent his life trying to find her. She brought simple flowers, stood quietly for a few minutes, and finally said, almost like a confession, "They tried to erase me, but in the end, they handed me back to myself." There was no triumph in that sentence, only closure. As she walked away, no one recognized her. No security, no photographers, no guests, just a woman walking with steady steps, unafraid of becoming invisible again. Because now she knew exactly who she was, and that at last was something no one could take. Madeline's life could have ended right there on the cold floor of the Belmont ballroom, her dignity trampled under laughter and flashing lights. But it didn't. Because what looked like rock bottom was, in truth, the first step of a staircase no one else could see. A staircase she had to build herself, using rage, grief, courage, and silence. She could have chosen to disappear. She could have used her inheritance to take revenge in the cruelest way, to humiliate back, to crush the people who once called her trash. But she didn't. What Madeline did was much more powerful. She looked at everything she'd lived. The abandonment, the kidnapping, the rejection, the coldness of the system, and decided to turn all of it into a tool. The Wellington Empire she rebuilt is no longer made only of stock and profit. It's made of decisions that actually change destinies, of boardrooms where people now sit who once upon a time would never have been allowed through the door, of memories that aren't denied or buried, but welcomed, because she knows exactly what it's like to grow up in silence, in fear, in the feeling of being invisible, and now, finally, she isn't anymore. The Belmont name faded from the headlines, but the Wellington name started to mean something again. Not because of the fortune, but because of the heiress who didn't just inherit assets. She inherited the pain of a father who never stopped looking for her, and of a mother who was taken far too soon. Madeline isn't a symbol of easy bounce back. She's the symbol of strength that bled, of dignity that fell but got back up, of justice that didn't need to scream to be heard. And you, if you were in her place, what would you have done? Would you have signed those papers? Would you have forgiven? Would you have stood up again? Tell me in the comments, which part of this story hit you the hardest? Have you ever lived through a plot twist no one saw coming? Or do you know someone who was once thrown away and now shines even brighter? And if this story held you all the way to the end, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because here every week we tell stories that show what most people never see, but every heart can feel.